Nikon announced the new D810. It's going to be out in about a month and it's ready for pre-order now. If you're interested in buying it, I'm going to tell you all about it. I'm going to compare it to the D800. I'm going to show you lots of sample pictures. We're going to go over pricing. I'm going to talk about which lenses you should use to get the most out of that amazing 36 megapixel sensor. If you want to pre-order it now, do me a favor, go to sdp.io/D810. That takes you to Amazon, and that just helps support us and keeps us doing what we're doing. So let's go quickly into some product pictures here. This is the front view of the D810. And if you're familiar with the D800, it's almost identical. We'll do some side-by-side pictures later. This is the rear view of it. You'll notice that this little segment here has been redesigned. They've made some changes to make the controls a little more friendly, the buttons a little easier to push. This is the top view of it. Same as it always has been. There's this kind of 1980s style black and white display up here, and buttons in their pretty usual places. If you're a Nikon user, you're going to be completely familiar with the layout of it. Let's talk about the key changes that they're making in comparison to the previous generation of the D800 and D800E. The first big change is that they still have a 36 megapixel sensor. It's the sensor from the A7R, and it has no optical low pass filter, no anti-aliasing filter. And those can be kind of different things. The D800 had both an optical low pass filter and an AA filter. The D800E had the optical low pass filter, what they call the OLPF, but it basically had the anti-aliasing removed, which made it a little bit sharper. So what these filters do is they reduce the number of moire and artifacts, kind of just crazy, weird-looking things that can happen if you're taking a picture of a brick building or a checkered shirt. It's not that big of a deal, and it's camera manufacturers are finally realizing that the trade-off in reducing the sharpness versus reducing the moire isn't really worth it, and they might as well just take off those filters, give you that extra detail. So all the latest generation of Nikon and Sony cameras don't have these filters on them, and it does make them sharper. If you look at Canon and some of the other manufacturers, well, mostly Canon nowadays, they still have those AA filters on, and it does reduce the sharpness some. They're advertising that it has one stop better ISO than the previous generation. That would mean that you're getting reduced noise, so you'd be able to shoot at ISO 200 now and get the same amount of noise that you were getting at ISO 100 before. But they mentioned that it's because of their new processing. That means that you're only going to see it in your JPEGs, if you take in-camera JPEGs. But if you're worried about that kind of thing, you're probably shooting RAW, right? So if you're shooting RAW, I'm going to bet you aren't going to see any difference. We're going to have to wait until the camera comes out and see if there is any difference. But I'm going to say probably not any noise improvements at all when you're shooting RAW. One thing they did improve that will reduce noise is they introduced ISO 64. That's a low ISO. In a time when manufacturers are bragging about getting higher and higher ISOs, I'm so happy to see somebody introducing a lower ISO, because I do basically all my commercial work at ISO 100, which is the base ISO for all the full frame cameras nowadays. ISO 64 lets in a third more light, and therefore it should have a third less noise. So we should be able to get cleaner images. In the studio, that's what we're all going to be using, 100% of us. So that's why ISO 64 is so important. I wish they would go even lower, but I am so glad. As far as I know, they're the first 35mm full frame manufacturer to allow shooting below ISO 100 natively. We're not talking about extended ISO, we're talking about native. So we should provide really clean images. They improved the LCD on the back, and we'll have to see it to believe it, but it's a little more detailed. It's supposed to be brighter, sharper, clearer, better color renditions. They've made the grips and the controls just better. It just should feel better in the hands. It should be a little bit easier to find the buttons, but for the most part, as you'll see later, the buttons are all in basically the same place. They've improved the software a little bit to improve the previous generation's ability to do time lapses and added exposure smoothing. So if you're doing a time lapse, you know what that is, where you can see the landscape or the stars move over a period of time. When the sun is coming up or going down, the brightness, of course, is going to change. And the previous generation could do these time lapses, but the changes in exposure could be rather abrupt if you had auto exposure on. And you'd either have to correct for that in software, which isn't that hard really, Or you'd see weird changes in brightness on your time lapse, so that should just smooth it out if you're into that. But if you're into that, you probably already have a software system to take care of that problem anyway. One of the things I'm most excited about is a new SDK, a software development kit. This means that developers will be able to write apps for the D800 or for the D810. This could be absolutely huge because Magic Lantern for the Canon cameras has been huge. And it's huge because Magic Lantern allows you to run your own custom software on the camera and extend its abilities. That's really, really exciting stuff. It's coming soon. They're just kind of promising it. I don't know if it's going to extend to the earlier generations of the camera or if it's going to be the D810 only. It's probably going to be the D810 only. And I don't know how they're going to determine which apps you can run on it. You can do this on a lot of the Sony cameras now, and I've played with it, and it has basically unlimited potential. So I'm excited to see how that's going to come out. They say it's going to be released July 17th, so that's when the retailers should be shipping it. And the body will be $3,300, which is funny because that's exactly the same price as the D800E is currently. So it is a substantial upgrade over the D800E at absolutely no additional price. And they're still selling the D800E for $3,300. They have to drop the price a little bit. I will say you'll be able to pick up D800E used for substantially less than that. But the new price is going to be exactly the same. Now let's talk about the improvements to the shutter on the D810. They've given you an extra frame every second, which is a pretty big deal, like 25% more frames from 4 frames a second to 5 frames a second, and that's if you're shooting full frame RAW, which is moving a whole lot of data around. That's 36 megapixels of raw data being moved from the sensor to the memory card. That's a lot. Now, that turns out it's the data bandwidth that seems to be the bottleneck, because if you shrink it down, if you take a smaller portion of the sensor, going with a 1.2 or 1.5x crop, you can get 6 frames a second. So you're not getting as much data, but you're getting more pictures, and that's going to be really useful to those of us who are going to be cropping anyway. If you're shooting sports or wildlife, for example, and your lens just doesn't reach long enough. If you add the battery grip, you can get up to 7 frames a second. That's actually faster than the 5D Mark III, which shoots at 6 frames a second. Full frame, mind you, as long as you don't mind a full 1.5x crop. The shutter is also supposed to be both quieter and smoother, so it will introduce less vibration. And this has been a problem in previous generations, and it's also a problem with the current A7R, which uses the same amazing 36 megapixel sensor. This means that for those of us shooting still life, night photography on a tripod, your pictures are going to be sharper and clearer. Now, if you're shooting sports, if you're doing wildlife handheld, it's not going to make nearly as much of a difference because you're kind of moving the camera on anyway. But if you're the type who's using a heavy tripod and taking all the most care to get sharp images, I think this will make a noticeable difference. We'll have to test it and find out. They are also allowing you to use an electronic front shutter when you're using live view mode. And that's going to mean the most, again, to the landscape photographers and the night photographers. It will just reduce the shakiness introduced by the shutter. And believe it or not, you can put the mirror up, which is good to do in live view mode, and moving that mirror out of the way does eliminate a little bit of the shake that can be introduced when you take a picture. But even the shutter moving out of the way can shake the camera just a little bit. Okay, for night photography, you're probably not going to see it unless you're doing like less than a 1-second exposure. It probably won't make a difference if you're doing a 10 or 20-second exposure. But if you're doing landscapes and you're working at a 30th of a second or a quarter of a second, I do think this will allow us to get clearer pictures. That's been my experience with some mirrorless cameras that have electronic shutters. Now let's talk about the autofocus system, because Nikon seems to be gunning for the 5D Mark III here. They've introduced 51 autofocus points, which, if you're shooting in DX mode, means the autofocus points completely cover the frame. You'll be able to focus on something in the upper right corner if you want to. That's going to be useful for wildlife and sports photographers. Of those 51 focus points, 15 are cross-type. The cross-type sensors can focus on both vertical and horizontal details, and that means that they'll focus faster and more precise, and especially when you're tracking action, sports and wildlife again, you're going to want to limit yourself to those cross-type focus points, no matter whether you're using Canon or Nikon or something else. And for that reason, those 15 are going to be really important to those of us who shoot action. 11 of those focus points will work all the way down to f8. We'll talk about how that compares to the 5D Mark III later. Being able to focus down to a lens with f8 is mostly important for wildlife photographers. For example, I have a 500 f4 lens. I'll sometimes put a 2x teleconverter on that, and that converts it to a 1000mm f8 lens. And my Canon 7D won't focus at f8. My 5D Mark III will focus at f8, and this Nikon will focus at f8, but using 11 autofocus points. So that's pretty remarkable. In the Canon world, you have to go up to the 1DX to be able to do that. It's also pulling in the group area autofocus system from the D4S. That means that multiple focus points will be able to work together in harmony, and that's tremendously useful when you're tracking a subject that you can't keep precisely in one part of the frame. And this happens when you're shooting flying birds, because you're holding the camera up here like this, and sure, you'd love to keep that bird precisely on one focus point, but through a massive telephoto lens, just nobody's quite that steady and precise. So the bird in your frame kind of moves around a little bit, and having it track with multiple focus points means you do have a little room to move the camera around and have the autofocus system continue to track it. Nikon's also bragging that it's going to focus down to -2 EV, which is a pretty remarkable number. If you're not familiar with the EV system, it just measures how much ambient light there is. And -2 EV is super dark. That's basically like a moonlit night, maybe not even a full moon, out in the wilderness. So you should be able to autofocus, you night photographers out there, as long as you have some source of light. And focusing is a tremendous challenge in night photography. So I am excited about that, and I can't wait to test it out. Nikon's also saying they've improved the live view autofocus system. That's good. I know a lot of people don't like to use live view, or if you do use live view, you're zooming in and manually focusing for really precise work. But now that I've been working with mirrorless cameras on a regular basis, I find myself wanting to use live view just to allow myself to hold the camera up or down. And these big DSLRs, they just suck at focusing using the live view, and that can be so frustrating when you're trying to get a high angle and your camera normally focuses super fast. Well, anyway, they've improved it. We'll test it when it comes out and see just how much they've improved it. Now let's talk about the improvements to the video system. Once again, Nikon's gunning for Canon, who's kind of known for DSLR video. So let's look at what they've improved. The biggest improvement is going to be a jump from 30 frames a second to 60 frames a second with the 1080p video. It's capturing twice as many frames. How can you use that? Well, most broadcast television doesn't support 60 frames a second, but you can put it on Blu-ray, and now YouTube is allowing you to upload 60 frames a second videos. You might not notice it on a talking head kind of video like this, but in anything with a little bit of action, even a little movement, it's noticeable. I've looked at 30 frames versus 60 frames a second, and 60 frames seems more natural and smoother. If you want to do slow motion, 60 frames a second will allow you to slow things down to half speed and maintain a 30 frames per second viewing rate. So that's a good thing. That's a feature that they have in all the lower end cameras that have been introduced recently, like the D800 and the D800, but good. Canon doesn't really have that in the full frame world. They're offering auto ISO for video, which seems like, of course, right? So you can put your camera into manual mode and lock the frame rate and lock the aperture. And if you're doing a run and gun style shoot, going from indoors to outdoors or pointing a camera through a window when the brightness changes, you can now rely on ISO to change the exposure automatically and kind of keep up with a changing environment. Before, you couldn't do it. You'd have to change the aperture or the shutter speed in the video. It's kind of like an of course, like other camera manufacturers offer that. Canon offers that. Anyway, the D800 didn't have it. The D810 does now. They're offering smoother iris control too during filming. So if you're filming and you want to increase the depth of field, it's a cinematic technique. You can bring the background into focus or blur the background during a scene. It'll be nice and smooth instead of being kind of jerky. They're offering a new profile for flat pictures. And what that means is the pictures are going to have less contrast. And that doesn't sound appealing, and it's probably not if you're doing still photography, and it wouldn't matter if you're shooting raw anyway. But for video, well, there is no raw video on this camera. So having a flat profile, low contrast profile will allow you to grade it later, and it will allow you to recover more of the highlights or the shadows in your processed video. If you're pulling your video into Premiere Pro or another editing app and you know how to grade video, you'll be excited about this. If you don't edit your video, if you don't grade your video, then you don't care. They're saying it has broadcast caliber audio control in camera, and I don't exactly know what that means. I couldn't find details about that. Hopefully you can record your levels. A lot of people insist on recording to an external device, and we'll do that sometimes, but it's really convenient to be able to record in camera. It just speeds up your workflow later, so you don't have to bother with syncing audio. You don't have to worry about another device that has batteries or something breaking. It's convenient. They're also adding zebra striping to show highlights in videos. Zebra striping will show the parts of the video that are potentially blown out, that might be overexposed, by just showing stripes across it. Most other cameras, like the GH4, offer this now, and some videographers insist on having it. Some of us just prefer to use a histogram. Now let's talk about the things I'm disappointed with the D810. This is a really highly anticipated camera, and of course we all had really high hopes for it. It didn't meet all our high hopes. First, they improved the image quality by taking out that AA filter, but it was kind of minimal. They didn't add more megapixels, or they didn't brag about more dynamic range or anything, so it should be better. Probably won't be a huge difference. The thing I'm most disappointed in, no 4K. I'm not shooting 1080p video anymore. We're strictly 4K. We have GH4s and we absolutely love them. We have a couple other 4K cameras that we work with too. It's 4K or nothing for me for video. And that means that this camera is a no-go for video. I know lots of videographers are going to be shooting 1080p for at least a couple of years. But even if you're rendering in 1080p, check out 4K video cameras, because you'll be so much happier with them. Definitely check out our review of the GH4. And I know everybody always busts on me when I say I want touchscreens on these like high-end cameras, but I want a touchscreen on a high-end camera because I work with them on the GH4s and other mirrorless cameras and cameras like the Canon 70D, and I love them. To be able to review the pictures you've just taken and use your fingers to immediately zoom in at the level you want and then pan around is immensely useful to the professional. If you take a group photo, you need to go back immediately and make sure everybody's eyes are in focus. And that requires zooming in tight and then panning around. And right now we do that with the stupid thumbstick, and it's a real pain, and it takes a while. It takes a few seconds. You could do it in a quarter of the time with a touchscreen. Get in and out of that shoot. Just give me a good touchscreen on these cameras. There's also no on-sensor phase detect focusing, and that would be tremendously useful for video, especially just to track moving subjects in video. This means that you're going to need a focus puller if you're going to be tracking any kind of motion in video, and that's an expensive solution. It requires basically two people working the camera and quite a bit of skill. The phase detect focusing that we have in the 70D works really well for that kind of thing, and it's much easier. There's also no Wi-Fi or GPS. They have this in other camera bodies like the D800, and it's terribly useful. I know, no pro wants this stuff, but we do. And sure, they offer add-on modules, but those add-on modules are expensive, and frankly, they're clumsy. And when you have them plugged in, your camera's not weatherproofed anymore, and it's one more thing to break and one more thing to carry. I don't know why they left off these really basic and professionally useful features off of a high-end camera. Previous generation didn't have them, but I would have hoped they would have added it. So now let's quickly look over some sample photos that Nikon has provided. And unfortunately, they're not everything we might have hoped. They're good photos, but they don't really provide enough detail. We don't have raw images yet, but I'll show you what we have. Here's just a wide angle shot, and they show in the corner here the amount of detail that those 36 megapixels can get. And yeah, it's fantastic that you can crop in that much and still see just so much detail. Here we see a night shot with a photographer who did not use a camera level. Sorry to bust on you, whoever you are. But otherwise, it's a lovely shot. It's showing off the nice dynamic range between the bright highlights here and the dark skies. Here we have like a studio shot, really intricate stuff. And again, they're zooming in to show plenty of detail, but you know, these sample photos just don't show enough. They don't have the full resolution versions of it, so they kind of leave you guessing. They just wanted to give you something. Again, kind of showing off the dynamic range that you can get with these cameras. And another studio shot. It's pretty, doesn't really tell us much about the camera. Now let's compare the D800E on your left there to the D810. The price somehow is the same. The megapixels are the same. The sensor has changed a little in that they took off the OLPF, the optical low pass filter, which should mean just a little bit of extra sharpness. We'll see how much there actually is. Instead of 4 to 6 frames a second, we're getting 5 to 7 frames a second. The higher numbers are when you crop the photos again. We're going from 30 frames a second to 60 frames a second. The D800E did not offer flat video, so this should give us more dynamic range for those of us grading the video. And the ISO range is going from 100 to 6400 to 64 to 12,800. They allow you to expand this on both these cameras, but the native ISO range is the range that the sensor is actually designed to work with, and that's generally where you'll get the best pictures, and that's really all that matters for those of us shooting RAW, because the extended range, you could always simulate that by just shooting at the top or lowest ISO and then adjusting your exposure in post. You'd get exactly the same results, and that's usually what I do. They're also offering spot white balance in live view, which is just, I think, an easy and quick way to set a perfect white balance off of a white card or something, if that's the way you're shooting. And of course, group area autofocus, as I mentioned, coming down from the D4S, which should improve tracking of birds and other moving subjects. Just to show you the differences in the controls as you look at the D800E on the left and the D810, almost nothing jumps out as being different, right? Like you can see the information button has been moved over here, and you can't really see it too much, but the AEL and AFL buttons and the AF on button are now on a little platform, which should make it a little easier to reach with your thumb. Just feels a little bit better in the hands. Here at the front view, again, looking at the controls here with the shutter, we see almost no differences. They're going to be functionally very, very similar. Now I'd like to compare the D810 to the old Canon 5D Mark III, which honestly, we use it all the time, but it's getting a little long in the tooth. Most significantly, the 5D Mark III currently is listed at $100 more than the D810. So it's older and more expensive, and even if the prices were the same, I don't know that it would win this competition. It has 22 megapixels versus 36 megapixels, so like 50% more megapixels, which is a pretty huge jump. And when you look at the pictures side by side, you'll know the difference. The Canon has an anti-aliasing filter, which just reduces the sharpness. It kind of means those 22 megapixels are worth even less. The D810, none of that. The Canon is a little bit faster, 6 frames a second as opposed to 5 frames a second when shooting full frame. But when you put on a battery pack and you shoot in DX mode, like you will for wildlife and sports, the D810 will give you 7 frames a second. 1 frame a second, one way or the other, can mean the difference between getting the shot or not when you're shooting action. So that can be really important to us that shoot sports and wildlife. Some of the video differences here. Now, Canon has been like the king of video since the 5D Mark II came out. And frankly, I think they're losing that title to Panasonic more than anybody. But increasingly to Nikon, as Nikon rolls out 60 frames a second throughout its lineup. The D800 has always had a pop-up flash, which I don't care about. I hate pop-up flashes anyway. But the 5D does not have that. Now the D810 has zebras and time lapses and interval shooting built into the camera. The 5D Mark III has none of that unless you install that Magic Lantern software. It's a hack. And it works. We use it. We use it on a lot of our Canons. But it's not great. It'd be better if it were integrated in. It can be a little flaky and it's kind of complex and it's kind of hard to install and you don't really know if it's going to be reliable enough for commercial work or whatever. Anyway, I wish Canon would go ahead and introduce those things and build it in. Now, the one advantage I really could find for the Canon over the D810 is that Canon really has more specialized lenses. So for the workhorse lenses, Canon and Nikon both have basically exactly the same things. They have the 70 to 200 f2.8 and the 24 to 70 f2.8, and all your Tamron and Sigma lenses are going to be exactly the same between the two platforms. But Canon has like the MPE 5x macro lens if you want to, I don't know, show hair follicles or something else really close up. And Canon has, that 400 millimeter f5.6 prime that's just amazing for wildlife, and Nikon has nothing like that. Canon has more tilt shift lenses, so just more specialized lenses for those of us who get into like weird photography. But for the average photographer, Nikon has just plenty of lenses. Now let's go through the autofocus systems, comparing the 5D Mark III to the D810. The 5D Mark III, 61 autofocus points, 10 more than the D810. In practice, that's pretty much a wash. Here's what makes the bigger difference: 41 cross-type points versus 15 cross-type points. If you're shooting moving subjects, you're going to want to limit yourself to those cross-type points because they work better than the standard points. And so the Canon has like 3 times more. That means it'll be able to track moving subjects more smoothly across the frame. My guess is the Canon's going to win for tracking motion still, but we'll wait until the camera comes in to officially test it. Here's a place where Nikon wins again. 11 f8 autofocus points. The 5D Mark III can only autofocus at f8 with that center autofocus point. And minor point, but something that's important to me, the D810 supports USB 3. That means you can just carry a cable with you and unload your pictures much faster than you can with the 5D Mark III's USB 2, assuming you have a computer that supports USB 3, but most new computers do nowadays. I just want to mention a deal that I found on the Nikon website. Basically, they're giving you a coupon towards future equipment if you buy a D810 and a bunch of new lenses or flashes and stuff. So I'll go over the details quickly. If you buy a new D810 and at the same time, it needs to be on the same receipt, you buy $1,750 worth of Nikon lenses and flashes, they'll give you a $200 coupon, good for buying more Nikon gear from that same distributor. It needs to be one of Nikon's like approved distributors, resellers. If you buy $3,500 in lenses and flashes, you get a $400 coupon. The $200 coupon means it's about a 4% off coupon, and the $400 coupon is about 6% off. If you want full 10% off, spend $7,000 on Nikon lenses and flashes. That sounds like a whole lot to spend on lenses and flashes, right? But it's a $3,300 body, and it's totally reasonable to spend 2 to 3 to 5 times more on your lenses than you do on your body. And in fact, it's kind of a mistake to drop $3,300 on a body if you don't plan to spend more than that on your lenses. Otherwise, you should probably go for a cheaper body and send some more of your budget over to your lenses. I'll talk a little bit later about the lenses that you might want to consider for the D810. In fact, I will talk more about those lenses right now. Up first, I wanted to compare the 5D Mark III versus the D810, or well, the D800E, because that's as close as I can get, and their performance with a common lens, a third-party lens that fits both platforms, the incredible Tamron 24-70 f2.8. Check out our review on that if you haven't yet. On the D800E, which should have similar sharpness and resolution to the D810, maybe not quite as much, this lens clocks in at 23 megapixels. So how does that work? You have a 36 megapixel camera and your lens produces about 23 megapixels of data. Seems like a bummer, right? But put that same lens on a 24 megapixel or 22 megapixel 5D Mark III and it only comes in at 18 megapixels. So because the D810 or the D800 have more megapixels, they're extracting even more detail out of the lens. Even if the lens can't completely make every single pixel on the sensor meaningful, more megapixels almost always means more lenses, unless you're using really cheap lenses. But the better quality of a lens you use, the more you notice the difference. What I'm saying is that even though this Tamron is only a 23 megapixel lens, you still get more detail out of it than if you're using a 23 megapixel camera. It doesn't quite match up one-to-one like that. More megapixels, better. Easy to remember. Let's look at the Nikon 24-70. It's not as sharp as the Tamron. It's only producing 21 megapixels, which again, it means you're not getting quite that 36 megapixels you were hoping to get, but it's still good. It's a great lens. It's generally a better lens than the Tamron. It's a lot more expensive too at $1,900. There's a link here if you want to check it out and support us. But it's also much sturdier. Overall, I'd rather have the Nikon than the Tamron, but the Tamron's an excellent and very sharp lens. The Nikon 70-200 is a little bit sharper, clocking in at 27 megapixels, almost using up that D800's full 36 megapixel sensor. I also wanted to show a fairly inexpensive at $600 third-party prime lens, the Samyang 24mm f1.4, which clocks in at a pretty amazing 26 megapixels. Amazing because that's about what the 7200 clocks in at, but it's at $2,400. This is at $600. So you can visit this URL right here, sdp.io/s24, if you want to check it out and buy it and support us. Those of us doing wildlife, this is the lens you want. The 600mm f4, $10,000. Yes, an amazing $10,000. And it only clocks in at 24 megapixels. So only. That's still a tremendous amount of detail. It's not quite as sharp as the new Canons, but the new Canons cost more too. And I bet you'll get more detail out of that 36 megapixels than you would by putting the Canon version on the lower megapixel Canon lenses. Finally, one of my least favorite lenses to actually carry is one of the best lenses to use. The 400mm f2.8 is just a heavy, heavy bastard. It's heavy and kind of short, actually. So it's really hard to lift and carry around. You pretty much always need to use it on a monopod or a tripod. But the sharpness in it is just unbelievable at 33 megapixels. It's the sharpest lens that I could find. That means you'll pretty much be extracting almost every bit of detail out of the amazing D800 and D810 if you don't mind showing $9,000 for it. It's mostly a sporting lens, so for soccer and football professionally. But some people do use it for wildlife too. I'd probably rather go for the 600mm, but the 400mm with a teleconverter on it is a pretty amazing combination for wildlife. Finally, I want to plug my own book. Thank you so much for watching. If you want more information about camera gear, if you want some more help picking bodies, lenses, flashes, studio lighting, including information about mirrorless cameras, if you want to understand the concepts, know which factors are important and which you can ignore for your specific style of photography, I'll walk you through all of it. It's a pretty thick book and it's constantly updated, so you know it stays up to date. When you put in that D810 information in real soon, along with a whole new update, lifetime updates for free. If you want to pick it up, the ebook version right now is under $9. You can go to sdp.io USBG if you're in the United States, or anywhere else in the world, just go to sdp.io/buybg. We can ship the paperback to you or give you the ebook. If you want more free videos, including our upcoming comparison of the Nikon D810 to the 5D Mark III, it's going to be a hell of a shootout. Be sure to subscribe, absolutely free. And if you have any questions, just add a comment below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you. Whew. Blew my voice right out. Oh my God.